everyone to this webinar from the Open Group, which today is being brought to us by Biz Design. You know that Biz Design is a very active member of the Open Group, and very lucky that they do bring some extremely good subjects and presentations to these webinars. Before I hand over to our speaker today, Bas van Giels, just let me make a quick introduction to some of the housekeeping issues to keep the event moving forward smoothly. Firstly, with regards to asking questions to our speaker today, probably the best facility to use is the text QA facility. You write a question in there that you'd like Baz to answer, and then I ask you to address the question to all participants. That one gets to see the questions that is being answered. We're also going to try and ask as many questions at the end of today's presentation, but I'm sure if we do run out of time, then Baz will be happy to take anyone's offline. So this event is being fully recorded. So if for any reason you have to leave early, or if you experience any local technical difficulties, and then sometimes the audio can let us down occasionally, then a full recording of today's event will be available from tomorrow, and everyone who's registered will get an email, the appropriate link where they can access that recording. I noticed on Baz's first slide he refers to availability of his slides. I know Biz Design are very good at making their slides available on the website, and I can see Baz will give a specific link where you can access those slides at this presentation. Baz, if you're ready, I'll ask you to start your presentation.
All right, Simon, and I'll get started. So welcome from me as well to today's webinar about preparing for turbulent future using TOGAF and ArchiMate in the justice domain. This presentation is about an assignment that I've done over the last year and a half at one of the organizations in the justice domain in the Netherlands. I've anonymized it to keep in line with all the regulations about confidentiality, but I'll share as much as possible during today's presentation. A little bit of an introduction for myself. My name is Bas van Giels. I'm a consultant, trainer and researcher for Biz Design. Most of my time is being spent on enterprise architecture. I worry about strategic management and data management. Those are the two other fields that I'm active in. I frequently publish on our blog. Some of the content that you see today will eventually make its way to the blog as well. Most of those blogs then in turn find their way into books. Here you see two book covers of recently published books. The left is The Practice of Enterprise Architecture, that's been around for about a year. It also covers TOGAF ArchiMate. And the other one, ArchiMate from Theory to Practice, is due to be released in 2 weeks or so. We're looking for the final print, so I'm really excited about that. Here you also see my email address. As Simon mentioned, if you have any questions after today's webinar and you want to get in touch, do feel free to contact me. I usually have a 24-hour service level agreement, but with a busy weekend coming up, I may have to postpone it until Monday, but we'll see how that goes. So the agenda for today's presentation, very high level. I'll start with the problem space, organization description, what's going on. So what is the domain that we're talking about, and what exactly was the challenge for us. Then we'll look at the approach. So how did we tackle these challenges, especially, of course, relate them to the position of TOGAF and ArchiMate. And last but not least, I would like to talk a little bit about the results. So show some highlights of the deliverables from this project and some next steps. So let's get started about in the problem space. I'll maintain a very high speed during the presentation, by the way. I know there's usually a lot of questions, so I'd like to cover them as much as possible at the end. So let's see. We're talking about a relatively small organization. It's about 300, 400 people. We have grown pretty fast over the last few years, in part because this organization is actually a merger of various smaller organizations. And these smaller organizations each have their own departments, processes, and systems. And, well, let's say the idea of post-merger integration, well, it remains a bit of a dream for this organization. So those mergers haven't really been processed fully. Though, is that to get this new organization offers integrated product and services to various customers within the bigger justice domain at large within the Netherlands. And some of the main things for this organization are to facilitate information exchange and communication within the justice domain. And another main challenge for this organization is to master data about, let's say, person per subdomain. So those are two big pieces of work that are very complex. There's a lot of legislation around it. You can imagine the privacy legislation especially is very tricky in this area. And within this domain, we had some architecture work. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But once again, I'd like to stress that the organization is very siloed, and integration, both in terms of processes and systems, is a wish, but it has never been really achieved during the presentation. If you look at this organization a little bit more closely, some challenges. First of all, the systems landscape, with I mean the information systems landscape, so applications, data, and infrastructure, that area. This has been audited several times in the past. Most of these audits focused on functional quality and technical quality. And we saw that the landscape is considered to be, well, poor, and in some cases very poor, especially in the technical space. So functionally, it's fairly okay, because this organization is really good at creating rather ad hoc solutions for its partners. But in the technical space, there are some serious issues there. In part, this of course is due to the ad hoc culture, because several attempts to overhaul the landscape and to bring it up to par again on a technical level have been stopped with very little success. The previous approach was stopped 2.5 years ago, and since then very little investment has been made in the technical quality ever since. So you can imagine that the technical quality actually deteriorates over time if you don't do anything. So there is a big burning platform in the system space. So if there's a big burning platform, then you might come up with the idea to close the doors, to close shop, and fix the landscape and then open the doors again. But this, of course, is not an option. So you have to structure while continue to offer your products and services. But not only that, the business, which our customers, are actually innovating. We'll have to work on, for example, on digitizing all core processes for the organization, and well, that also poses some big challenges. Organizational maturity. So a first analysis shows that the organization is not very mature. We see there's very little process thinking. We see that many departments do the same type of work, but in a different way. We also see that there's, in some cases, quite a bit of lack of trust between departments. But then again, we also see that some of the people who've been around for a while, they know each other, and because they know each other, everything still works. And well, the same pretty much for the change portfolio. There's little grip on it, but one way or the other, we always make things work for our customers. So in terms of maturity, it might be very low, but in the end, we always come through and we always deliver what is required for the customers. So that's a pretty interesting dynamic to work in. We have a lot of people who are focused on getting the results for the part of this organization, but it's increasingly complex because of a fairly low maturity level. So pretty much everyone in the organization recognizes the fact that something has to give, something has to change. And the challenge is to make that happen. As you can imagine, there's quite a bit of resistance as well, because changing always hurts. Challenge then, and what is our approach? When I did, the vision was that architecture will help us get a grip on these challenges. An interesting assumption, right? Usually we start elsewhere. We start with process optimization, we do lean, we do management, program management, whatever. But here we started with architecture, which I think is an interesting point of departure. when we started a year and a half ago, we had 4 main goals. One is, and perhaps that's the main one, is to build the architecture capability for the organization. Because if you have the capability, then eventually you have actually implement, and eventually things will improve one way or the other. That's still an assumption, but it's also a goal for the project. The other one is to develop an appealing target architecture for about 2025. So it should be a target architecture that will guide the development of the organization for the next 10 years or so. To make that guidance happen, we also developed a baseline information systems architecture. And whenever possible, some of the big change programs that are on the way are also to be supported with architecture. Those were the 4 main goals for the work that we did. I'll go through these challenges one by one, and I'll spend as much time as possible on the actual results to give you an idea of what we achieved. What's our approach? If you go back to the idea of, okay, this is what we want to do eventually, these are the challenges that we have, then the first thing to clarify is what effective architecture. I mean, these are pretty big, and what is the expected contribution of architecture? So that's where we wanted to start. Once you have a fair understanding of what the goals for architecture are, then you can use that as an input for building capability, as well for the development of the architectures. This is, of course, where TOGAF and ArchiMate come in. TOGAF is very good at describing the architecture capability. Right? We have the capability framework, we have the architecture development method, we have all sorts of stuff that helps us building the capability. And ArchiMate as the language is great for developing the actual architectures. And of course, we use BizDesign Architect as a tool to document and analyze these architectures. Both the capability and the architectures that are under development are used to support actual programs and projects in the organization. Initially, of course, there's very little of the capability in place. You don't have a full understanding of the architecture yet, so support for programs and projects will be, let's say, limited. But once you start building the capability and start developing those architectures, then the support for ongoing programs and projects can slowly increase over time. So that was the idea. In a little bit more detail, we started with 4 iterations for building the architecture capability, and as you can see here, we started with the iteration around the goals for enterprise architecture. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Once you understand the goals, then you can worry about the process. Once you know the process, then you can figure out how many people in which type of roles do I actually need, and how are we going to train them, and so forth and so on. And not least, you have to worry about all sorts of, support stuff, for lack of a better word. Think here of tools, templates, big A0-sized printers and whatnot. So those are the 4 iterations that we went through in space. And of course, we based ourselves on TOGAF's ADM here. That was our point of departure. It's about building the baseline models, and we started when we were a few weeks into the program, information systems landscape. And a little bit after that, we started with developing the target architecture. So that was about January of this year. And for both the baseline and the target architecture, we of course used ArchiMate, as I just explained. The entire process, we support the projects and programs as much as possible. And as I mentioned, this started with very thin support, so mainly some guidance, some advice on what type of things you have to consider. And later on, this involvement became bigger and bigger and bigger. We were involved in the definition of one of the main programs to overhaul the information systems landscape in the end. Of course, just one aspect of an approach. You also have to worry about how to involve the organization. You can't just flesh this out on your own little island or in your ivory tower. You have to, let's say, get as much of the organization on board as possible, while at the same time keep your core team that works on this puzzle as small as possible, because if the group becomes too big, then you will have no results. So the diagram on the right sort of captures how we did this. We had a core architecture team of 5 people who did most of the work in those iterations. It's an expert group or sounding board, for those of you who know Dutch, a klankbordgroep, that we could talk to for specific topics. So we had some security experts, we had experts for each of the main product areas for several of the systems. We had some process experts. So whenever we tackled a specific problem, those were the people we talked to. They gave us feedback, which we of course processed, and at the end of the day, top management was accountable and owner of everything that we created. We had a very, very good working relation with top management within this organization. Here was by involving top management, who has of course a direct line to middle management and the work floor, as well as by talking to this expert group as much as possible, who also have a direct line to the working floor within this organization. You have good access to the root of the organization, so to speak. And it turns out that this was actually quite problematic. Get lines of communication to work is one of the main challenges in this type of project. And well, we managed to get it going to some extent, but my opinion is that we could have done a little bit better in that space. Last but not least, top management, of course, also owns the main programs and projects. And as I mentioned, we had a good working relation with them as well. Here, I would also like to mention that the capability framework of the TOGAF standard, of course, available online, was a big inspiration for getting all of this to work. We found that the way of working and the way of thinking that is described there was a very good point of departure to get us going. But at the same time, we saw that if you look at the standards, then that's a lot of pages, and you have to make it practical. So TOGAF and ArchiMate are adopted by the Dutch government as standards for EA, but we really wanted to tune it down a little bit and make it more practical. So my previous book, The Practice of Enterprise Architecture, we already captured best practices or good practices from the last 5, 6, 7 years or so. Most of the ideas that are in that book were also used for this engagement to make a quick start. And of course, we used our architect tool for as a basis for modeling to speed up the modeling process, and we had some really good results there as well. So then, talking about the approach, I think that's quite important to give you a feeling on how to tackle problems this scale. Let's look a little bit at some of the results of this project. And we started with the goals for enterprise architecture, and here we used a model from Gartner. And Gartner has a nice 2x2. We make it more complex than the consultants among us don't understand it anymore. A nice 2x2 matrix where we talk about enterprise scope versus local scope, and a more strategic focus versus a more tactical focus. We discussed this in great detail in our workshops with the core team and the expert group. And for the maturity of this organization, we decided with a little bit more than a local scope and a little bit more than a tactical focus, where we should focus the architecture capability on. And this is also a good basis for the 2025 architecture that we are to develop. But of course, you want to take into account that you want to grow both in scope and in focus eventually. But we have to recognize the fact that you can't go from 0 to 100 in 2 seconds or something along those lines. Or as the English say, you have to walk before you can run, I suppose. Hope that we chose. It took a bit of figuring out, but eventually we got some good support and some commitment across the organization for this. Well, the biggest challenge, looking in my opinion, is coming up with a good architecture process. Of course, it's easy to say we'll take the architecture development method of TOGAF and that's just what we'll do. Then you go, and if you want to know how to operate this process, you can download the specification, and good luck to you. What will work? Given the scope that we just defined, we recognize that our architecture development process has to be integrated with the development process of the organization. So, and there are various types of development processes in the organization. So many different flavors of this process exist within the organization. Right? We have business innovation, we have IT development process, we have business input, we have all sorts of development processes within the organization. And if you look at the different silos within the organization, they all do it in a different way. How do you want to plug an architecture development process into each and every one of those highly unstandardized processes? That's quite a challenge. Just about 40 workshops to get an understanding of the development process and to align the architecture development process with it. Some of those workshops were actually process simulation. So we developed a hypothesis, like this is what the development process could look like at a very high level of abstraction. This is what we believe the architecture development process should look like. These are the roles. So let's sit around the table and just take a real life case and play it out and see how it goes. Then you get into all sorts of challenges. You use a few more workshops and then you simulate it again. And the simulation actually worked quite well. After a couple of cycles, we had a really good development process, which I would say is percent ADM and 20% simplification mostly. Architecture development, we also, of course, developed some other process, let's say around lifecycle management of the architectures, governance process, but the main one, of course, is the architecture development one. In an organization of this type, where you have many different roles, many different people running around and trying to solve real problems for real customers, roles and responsibility is always a big issue. Right? We have a lot of people who want to be part of the process, who have very good insights that they want to use and want to bring to the table. But in order to make it manageable, we had to come up with a very detailed RACI table to mention who is accountable, who is responsible, and to show to everyone in the organization that there will be consulted when good input for the actual development. The last I would like to mention about this specific slide is we fleshed out the development process in a lot more detail, so different steps, templates, roles and responsibilities, everything and so forth. It has been documented. And even during the development of this process, we started using it already for various big programs, as mentioned here on the slide. Okay then. Describing a process is one thing, but implementing it is another. For the organization, the road to success is to think before acting. Right? The same thing if you have a customer or a partner who wants something, then you jump into action and start doing stuff. Right? That's a lot of organizations do. We think, or we thought, and we the organization based on this thinking, that it's a good idea to think and to worry about the architecture at a very high level before diving into real projects. So the one thing that we really hammered into this organization is a major paradigm shift, where you worry about architecture first, baseline, transition, target, very high level architectures, do gap analysis, work breakdown, group it into work packages, and only then start acting in the sense of actually building stuff in the organization. It feels like sitting on your hands for a little bit longer, but it turns out that this pays off in the long run. Thinking just a little bit longer will pay off if you get a better grip on your change portfolio, if you better grip on your landscape, if you have less duplication. Well, you already know all this stuff. Of course, there's a major paradigm shift. This is not what we're used to. While we have some initial success with this approach, I think it will take several more years, 2, maybe 3 years, even with the good management support that we've had, to actually have the organization through this paradigm shift. So changing a culture always takes long, but in this case, I think it might be as much as 2 or 3 years or something along those lines. the iteration was about the people aspect, as I mentioned. We had 3 different roles that we identified: a lead architect, who is accountable for everything related to architecture, enterprise architects and solution architects. We followed definitions again that are quite close to what is specified in the TOGAF standard. But then the next question that pops up is, how many do we need? How many people do we need to man our architecture capability? Was look at the project portfolio that they have. It's in t-shirt sizing. So small, medium, large, based on the budget of the project and the estimated amount of months project. Of course, the assumption is that smaller projects tend to require less architecture than large programs. And based on the experience figures, we calculated we have 50 small projects times so many hours times so many deliverables equals this amount of work, and the same for medium and large, and then you add it up and you get a rough idea of how many people that you need. Then you know how many people you need, but still the architecture function can be performed at different levels of proficiency. Right? We have junior architects, media architects, senior, very senior, or whatever levels that you want to come up with. What we did was we looked at the skills framework from TOGAF, and we combined it with the European skills framework, and we list of skills that are relevant for architects. And we said each of those skills can be performed at 5 different levels of proficiency. So that's the top table over there. And it is very precise what type of behavior and diplomas and whatever we would like to see for each of those 5 levels. Great people. So if you say, well, I'm a lead enterprise architect, for skill number 2 or competence number 2, I score a 4, and you can just look at the top table to see if that's indeed the case. So by making it very smart and very precise and very formal and very exact, we were able to very easily profile people against this skill framework. And it was actually not so hard to see that we had a few people within the organization who are ready to move into an architecture position at the media or maybe even at the senior level. But some of those more senior and even the lead function, you may have to acquire from outside, so you have to do some hiring. Hiring's actually still underway. We're working on it. Let's move from building the capability. I hope you have a sense of how we approach this and where we are at the moment. Let's move on to the actual modeling part, which is also interesting, I think. And we'll add the information system space, and we considered each of the information systems one at a time initially. We used ArchiMate, and we started with red number 1 over here, or red box, white number 1. The systems, we look at a very high level functional decomposition. We looked at what are the main components, what are the main functions, and what are the main data objects of the information systems. So we leveled it down to 2, sometimes 3 levels to get a really good understanding of what that system looks like. It's to worry about what services do we use from other systems and which services do we offer to other systems. So that's number 2 here in this diagram. And the third one is, what does the system do for various business processes of our partners within the broad justice domain? And last but not least, we looked at the infrastructure support. So what infrastructure services do we need? What nodes do they run on? What are the platforms that they run on? And where do they plug into the network? Network analysis, of course, is very important from a security perspective. One system at a time. Here we see a very high-level overview diagram of results. But if you get that in a little bit more detail, we again used workshops, one system at a time. For each system, we created a specialized team who have a solid understanding of that system, both in a functional and a technical sense. and used about 1 week per system. So we covered the 12 biggest systems, and for those 12 systems in total, we had about 1,000 model objects and about 1,500 relations, as you can see here also in the various charts that are outlined on this diagram. I'm actually quite happy about this. It was a really speedy process. At the end of the day, we were able to do some pretty interesting analysis. For example, the platform of vendor X, where we use it, and without too much hassle, we quickly had lists. We created various analysis for road mapping later on when we started the program for migrating the application landscape. So those models have really proven their worth. Of course, one of the tricks now is to make those models and to keep them up to date. That's part of the architecture development process that we fleshed out earlier. It was quite useful. Several posters have been created, on big posters that are everywhere in the building now. We have HTML reports that we created that are available on the intranet, so people can simply look at the models and give feedback. And this is really a successful part of the project, from my opinion. The target architecture turned out to be a little bit more key, so to speak. I also think it's more interesting to think about the future architecture, but still, you have to do both. So we chose an interesting time frame. 2025 is 10 years from now. Who knows what the world will look like, especially with everything that's going on in the political landscape at the moment. But we want to tackle this problem. One of the things that you need is a good insight in the strategic direction of the organization, as well as what's going on at your partners. So what happened within the bigger justice domain. We saw that digitization of processes, for example, is a theme, but there are many more. And what does that mean for your role as an organization in the bigger whole? And what we found is that management found it pretty difficult to articulate their goals and the strategy for the future, even for the near future. We had some very good workshops with management. We had strategic questions that we discussed with them. Debates, and at the end of the day, they said, you know what, it's impossible to answer these questions because on the political climate and how much room we get within the overall domain. Say that we want to do X, Y, or Z, or that we want to launch this project, or that we want to offer this type of services, but we can say that we want at least have the flexibility to offer that type of services, depending on the political climate. That was not what we were hoping for. But we had a good discussion about the fact that flexibility does not come for free. Right? It also comes at a price. Then went back, we had more desk research, and we decided to look at some industry models. So we looked at the Nexus of Forces, Internet of Things. We looked at Gartner space layering by modal IT. We had already done a business model canvas, which captures our understanding of the strategy of the organization. We also did an operating model discussion. So quite a few inputs to start fleshing out the target architecture for this organization. Still, it feels a little bit awkward to get to work without a real strategic direction. So we said, you know what? Rather than working on a target architecture, which is a fixed point in time, like a real end point, let's work on a target architecture that is more of a sense of a direction. Like, this is how we think we solve problems in the near future. This is how we feel the information systems landscape should develop in the near future. This is how we believe the project and business capability architecture will look like for the organization, and use that to guide future direction. So what does that look like? It's impossible to reproduce the results of about 20-30 workshops that we did over about half a year. I've taken 2 pictures from the slide set and that we had over the months. And I would like to start here on the left. We look at this organization, and when we look at it from an operating model perspective, then we noticed that there is a very high degree of integration of data and fairly low degree of process standardization among each of the silos. This suggests, if you look at the literature at least, and if you confront that with the base layering architecture strategy from Gartner, that you work with an integrated data core. Integrated data core. On top of that, you build some very flexible IT services that you can configure based on the ever-changing needs within the justice domain. Those flexible IT services are used to create that integrated offering for actors in the primary processes in the justice domain. So the link from data to the actor is actually quite important because you have to keep track of actor, so a cop or a lawyer or what do you call it? Well, never mind. Actors who actually execute the primary processes. You have to know who asked for what information, when, for which case, what was the actual answer that we've given them. So tracking actor all back to the integrated data core, security and privacy perspective is really important. That really gave us some headaches, but we had some really interesting answers there. We have this onion model, so to speak. How does it translate then in the structure of the target architecture? Played with, initially was really playing around on a whiteboard with various options, and eventually we settled on a structure that we see on the right here. Mimic the onion layer model as much as possible. So we started with a data core. All the data objects in the baseline architecture were about 70 or 80 different types of data that we saw baseline architecture. We analyzed that also in light of applicable legislation, and we came up with 4 main databases that we need to develop for this organization. Databases, as if I'm talking about data stores, but what actually it means is that there are categories of data that we need to store for this organization. We went a little bit further as well. The IT strategy was being written as we were working on the target architecture, and we also analyzed the nature of the data in a little bit more detail. And we found that part of it will be relational in nature, but other parts of it are very much not relational in their nature. So we expect also from a technical perspective that our new architecture will also have key value stores, graph databases, and that type of stuff. So while this picture is just a very high-level framework, there's actually a lot of analysis underneath, and I'll give some insights in how that worked. So stores, a mapping on data objects, and an analysis of the type of data, and a very broad idea on how to structure that. If you then need flexible IT services to come up with integrated service offering, then the next step is to worry about your functionality layer. It might be very stable. As we just discussed, we don't know what the next question will be that we have to answer for our customers. How are we going to build a flexible landscape? Again, we analyzed all the application functions that we had in the model, in the baseline model, brought out various scenarios saying, well, what if the justice domain moves in this direction? What if the justice domain moves in that direction? And analyzed those application functions and services in that light. And it turns out that the logistics model, logistics concept, works really well for this functionality. Mainly, this means that you accept new requests from the outside. You process and analyze what type of request it is. You process the request, figure out all the information that you need. You patch an answer and slowly send it back to your customer. So input-output model, logistics concept. And this is how we structured the functionality landscape. Here's all sorts of principles, high cohesion, low coupling type of principles, but also, of course, principles that are very closely related to us allowed legally from a privacy perspective. It turns out that we had a really good functional architecture there. We tested this against various actual use cases that the organization is struggling with right now. And within half a day, we were able to come up with a target architecture for those problems in light of this functional decomposition and logistics model. So that worked out really nicely. The trick is to figure out what type of standardized integration functionality do you need, on the one hand, to make that functional layer work, and on the other hand, to create links between your functional layer and your data layer. Here we decided to use new types of technologies such as data virtualization, where we see all our internal data as well as potentially external data, external registration of our partners in one virtual database, and use privacy by design principles to filter out data that you are allowed to see an actor in the primary process in the justice domain. Virtualization is one of the integration services that you see over here. Of course, there are other integration services around workflow, messaging, rule management, and what have you. And here we followed a typical strategy of figuring out what are the services, how can we group those services in logical infrastructure components, and then look at make or buy decisions. In my opinion, it's the type of functionality that you shouldn't build yourself, but you should just buy from vendors. I think a best of breed or a suite approach. That's open for discussion in my opinion. Bottom three layers here are the information systems. Is the structure of the information systems architecture for 2025. In the top two layers, you see the business architecture, where we have products and services. We identified 4 categories of products and services, and a capability architecture. So about products and services, here we analyze the existing products and services, and as discussed, it is pretty hard to figure out what the future products and services will be. So we work with categories of products and services instead, map those onto a capability architecture. So if you're familiar with ArchiMate modeling, typically what we do is link products and services to processes and then figure out how these processes are supported by functionality. Well, at the beginning of this presentation, we saw that process thinking is still pretty hard for this organization. So this is why we went to capability architecture instead. And it's fairly easy to say, well, if we have a new, let's say, an information product and service that we want to offer to our customers, which of the capabilities do we need? That's an exercise you can do in about an hour. Chain these products and services into a process, you can chain these capabilities into a process, and from there on you can dig down into detail in the functional integration and in the data layer. 2 more, we have principles and we have security architecture. Some of the principles we came up with ourselves, and others come from reference architecture, such as NOR, which is a Dutch government reference architecture. You don't have to invent the wheel yourself every time, so to speak. And also came up with a really nice way of working where we integrate the security processes with the architecture processes. So we have a really good security architecture in here as well. Very nicely aligned, based on risk analysis, based on the applicable legislation and so forth and so on. So over a very complete approach, in my opinion. I hope a high-level overview gives you a little bit more detail about, a little bit more insight in how we structured everything based on the analysis that we did before. So how did we document this? Well, a model, as you can imagine, you can just write down as a huge ArchiMate model, right? About 1,000 concepts, 1,500 relations. Since the target architecture is more of a direction rather than target architecture, we chose a different approach. We simply wrote it down as a Word document of about 80 pages. We want to keep it as small as possible, but not smaller, to paraphrase Einstein. Well, part of the model are fleshed out in detail using ArchiMate diagrams, but part of the target architecture, of course, is just text to bring those models alive. Target architecture document is aimed at, in part, at management. So there's a very large part of this 80 pages is aimed at top management and middle management of the organization, and the rest aimed at architects and product specialists and business specialists who understand the organization really well. To bring that overall framework to life, we fleshed out a detailed example where we take an actual problem of a product and a service that we want to offer. We mapped it onto capabilities. From the capabilities, we went to a process, and then we covered it also with an information systems architecture based on the logistics model that we just saw. And it really brings everything to life. This is rolled out across the organization as we speak. Several workshops are planned, and well, we get a lot of people on board. So let's get some lessons learned. And we had really good support from management, and that goes a long way. I'm really happy about that. The communication, the strategic dialogue was really well. But getting traction in the organization is at least as important. I know that there was still some frustration about the past. As I mentioned, some of the groups, well, there's some lack of trust here and there, and breaking through that is quite a challenge. So it's really important to get a lot of people on board when you try to tackle a problem of this magnitude. Working several parallel streams gives really good results. Right? If you just do one after the other and sequence it, then the process becomes much longer, and people will have to wait really long before they see some real results. So here we decided to work on the long-term view while at the same time delivering results and just getting our hands dirty. It also means that sometimes you have some rework because you thought you were going left, but in the end, after some more careful analysis, you decided to go right. C'est la vie, right? I think sometimes speed is more important than getting the answer ready first time. So we really liked working in parallel work streams. It's okay to ask the hard questions. Right? I mentioned that we had some really tough sessions with management about strategy and the future. We really pressed hard to get some answers, and those real answers, well, it may take a while, and people sometimes say, I don't know, and that's okay. As we're open and get the dialogue going, that changes expectations and opens up the door to building trust, which is really important to making this a big success. Also, I found that tool support is really crucial. At some point, you're working on process, you're working on baseline architecture, you're working on target architecture, you have a lot of balls in the air. You have to figure out dependencies within a model, across models, whatnot, and there tooling is really crucial. Found business design architect to be quite a big help, especially in planning the big programs. Next steps. So what did it look like? There are some things I would like to highlight here. Of course, there's a lot to be said. First of all, yes, the process, and yes, we pushed the first domino, the second domino falling, but you have to keep going. Right? Implementing a process and going to that culture shift, the paradigm shift takes a while. So this means that we have to train and position architects. We have to continue to align our architecture processes with other processes. Here I'm thinking about portfolio management, product development, that type of stuff. And piece of work that is being undertaken at the moment. My hopes are up here. Second, the strategic dialogue that was going really well, but there are still some questions that are unanswered. So this dialogue has to continue, and as we get more answers, we'll have to update the architecture, and that probably means an evolution. Maybe some things will change, but what I expect is that it will be a matter of adding a little bit more detail here and there. Last but not least, also not to be forgotten, if you want your baseline models to continue to be valuable, I mean, we invested quite a bit of time in creating them, then you have to actually maintain and extend them even as time moves. So I think the key to success is in using what has been created for this organization. Thank you for your attention. I hope there are some questions. I think we have a few minutes left, Simon.
Yes, thank you very much for that. As usual, a really interesting insight into a practical architecture project there. Yes, we do have some questions, so I'll work through them one by one on QA facility.
Okay.
First of all, we have a question from Ramesh. He's asking, is there any specific reason why integrated services offering is in red?
It was just to visualize it a little bit differently in one of the slides to make the text more readable. So there's no specific semantics behind the color over there other than keeping the slide readable.
Excellent, Baz. Well, that's as good a reason as any. So it's we get a question from Milan. Have you been involved in some program and project architecture review or audit activities while working on the architecture? If so, how did you manage that?
Absolutely. So, as we have a saying, we translate into the butcher should not be in charge of doing his own product. And I guess the same is pretty much true for architecture, right? If you create an architecture, then you should not be the one to judge whether it's a good architecture, yes or no. So I mentioned that we started quite a few projects, but also some big programs for this organization while we were building the Architecture 2025 and building the architecture capability. What we did here was apply the idea of separation of concerns. So we asked a solution architect to really go for the solution architecture for those programs. And our role as a core architecture team became more in the review mode. So we gave some guidance, like this is where we think we should be going. This is our current understanding of the target architecture for the overall organization. Back to you. And while working and afterwards, we looked at the architecture products that were created by the solution architect and with a good review sessions. So looking at the document, which is one option, we had some really good review sessions where we went through it step by step and looked at the actual results. And in some cases, we just had joint working sessions to figure out more details. And I think that worked really well because there's a two-way communication that you start at. On one hand, you give guidance to the solution architect, and on the other hand, the solution architect will run into all sorts of challenges and say, you know what, it's good that you thought this was going to work, but I think you're wrong, and have a good dialogue about who's right and what will work and what will not work and how to move forward. So yeah, that was a really valuable part of our work, I think.
Okay, that's a quick reiteration. We've got a couple of questions asked about slides. Baz has put the link there up on the current slide for where you can download his presentation. So do visit the Biz Design website where you can find his presentation and others, including other webinars they've done with the OGF group. So another question here, Baz. How does the client architecture integrate into the overall Dutch e-government architecture, if at all?
That is of course the big puzzle, right? You look at the overall architecture for the Dutch government, and then you zoom in on the part for the justice domain, and then you're about okay, what is my place in the bigger whole, and you use it as a point of reference. When we started, we did quite a bit of desk research to figure out what was already in place, and it turns out that sure, there are some things, there are some documents, some aspects that are documented, but all of it isn't, or at least not yet, or not stable yet, or a development, or be revised and whatnot. So those documents was a bit of an issue. So we took a two-pronged approach here. On the one, we said, you know what, develop this for us as an organization is a big challenge in its own right. So let's first look at our own architecture and then worry about alignment with the bigger whole. So that's one part of thinking. The other is, let's find people who are part of our core team and in our expert group who are very well aware of what is going on in the bigger whole. So people who operate on the just department level as a whole and give their input at that level frequently, so they know what's going on over there. And they take that knowledge into our working sessions, and that way we also have some alignment. So we saw, for example, there are some golden rules that are being used at the justice level, and those are also part as the principles for our target architecture. So we created some links by involving the right people, but we decided really to focus on our own organization first. Of course, in future iterations, it will become increasingly important to build that alignment, which is not a challenge. I mean, that will be a big chunk of work for the near future. Absolutely.
Question here from Ed. He's asking about the NIEM standard? He said, are you using the NIEM standard for information exchange, for instance, the justice domain within NIEM? He goes on, if so, how are you approaching this? He says, this is a major effort for us in sharing information with our CA corrections justice partners.
Well, there are many steps around information exchange and information integration. Within the justice domain, in the Netherlands at least, we have EB standard. NIEM I'm not very familiar with, but we investigated a lot of the reference architectures that are out there and the standards that are out there. And whenever a standard was formally in place, meaning someone has said this is the standard and you better comply with it, then of course we simply followed this to the letter. In other cases, we saw that there are no standards in place, and then we said, well, let's develop a standard ourselves, or let's raise the issue at the justice level, at the bigger level, and work on it together. And a good example there, for example, is a canonical data model, where you, of course, worry about semantics of information that you exchange. So close cooperation there has led to the development of a standard. How we dealt with that specific issue. But IAM, no, we did not use that to the best of my knowledge.
A question here from Mohammed. Mohammed says he missed part of your presentation, but he'd like to ask you, to build the base model, how much effort did it take you? And he's asking about time and manpower. And he said, what would that be relevant for a mid-sized financial institution? How much effort would it take to build the base model at a high level?
At a high level. Well, I guess that's the big question, right? Where does at a high level stop and where does the build level start? We decided to go for a time-boxed approach where we had one system at a time. We had a small working group of about 4 or 5 people per system. Per system, we did a functional decomposition, 3-4 sessions of a couple of hours. And then it was a matter of a few more hours of inputting everything into the tool. So 12 systems times 1 week is 12 weeks. And of course, you're not full-time working on this, but that gives a ball figure of a high-level based on information systems architecture. At least we tackled it. Of course, if you need more details, if you also want to go into which security measures are in place, what exactly is the logical data model of each of the systems, blah, 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 then, well, that's a lot of work. On how much documentation you already have in place. With functional descriptions of each of your systems, then you might be able to speed this up even more. But in general, I think 1 week per system is a very good time box.
That's great. Question asking about governance framework. You said a governance framework used to ensure programs, projects are aligned with the EA solution. For instance, to discourage siloed applications and services as the EA strategy is executed.
Mm-hmm. Well, here the challenge is to get a grip on all changes that you are going to execute in your landscape. So what you want to do is to create a funnel. No one can build anything unless you go through the funnel. Funnel at the end, in the funnel, you throw all the changes, change requests, new ideas, updates, whatever it is. They all go into the funnel, and somewhere in that funnel, you have portfolio management where someone decides, okay, these are the the issues that we're going to tackle in the next few iterations or in the next release, depending on which part of the landscape we talk about. And after comes a step where architecture is involved, and you decide, okay, this is something where we can just follow our normal approach and integrate it in the overall landscape, or is it something that requires a small silo? If it requires a small silo, is it then a temporary silo, and are we going to integrate it later? Or how do we see this? I mean, siloing in itself doesn't have to be bad. In some cases, you actually want silo, for example, because of performance and privacy reasons. In other cases, you say, you know what, it's more important that we have something in the air in 2 weeks. It's going to go live in 2 weeks, and we'll just integrate it later. We'll just don't worry about it anymore. But the only way to even have that discussion is if you manage the funnel at the beginning of the process. And that's one of the big challenges that this organization is tackling at the moment.
Thank you, Ben. I know we've hit the top of the hour, but I'd just like to finish off these last couple of questions, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
We can hear, were there lessons learned specifically when trying to correlate TOGAF viewpoints versus ArchiMate viewpoints? He says, for example, did you follow Project Harmony?
No, how to answer this one? We out a version of the ADM that is very specific for this organization. And for each of the phases in our specific version of the ADM, we created templates for each of the documents that you have to create. So far, so good. In each of those documents, of course, we say, you know, in a vision document, you have to do a stakeholder analysis, and please use ArchiMate viewpoint XYZ. And in an ADD, you may want to do an information decomposition diagrams. Please see viewpoint over there. But the type of problems that we're going to cover with this process is huge, right? On the one hand, we're going to tackle information systems types, but also part of the reorganization of this organization is going to be tackled by this as well. The viewpoints that you use are different depending on the type of project that you want to tackle. Rather than specifying which viewpoints to take, we merely made the suggestion that look at examples from the specification and or the ArchiMate specification and leave it up to the judgment of the architect in question to decide which to use. Of course, there are some more guidelines to it, but I think that's also some more standardization in that aspect might be part of the next iteration and the next level of maturity for the architecture capability at this organization.
Thank you, Ben. We just better make this one the last question from Vijaya, asking, within the data layer, was the regulation part of it? He says, yes, how is it related to each services, and what was the approach to support and regulation changes?
Well, your law is everything, right? In main, be able to track which actor requested what information and is even able to ask for certain types of information, and tracking what answer is everything. Management is huge here. So we actually started with an analysis of the applicable legislation and the privacy by design principles, and on that you get a framework. Which can then be painted in or fleshed out in more detail by dropping in the actual data objects that you want to store, and add a structure of the 4 databases that, as we saw earlier on. So I think the analysis is 70% privacy by design and being able to shield undesired behavior, and 30% is, okay, what is the actual data that we're going to put in there? So that to give you an idea of where the complexity actually is. We spent over a month analyzing this with a fairly big group of people on how to do this. But once you have it, right, we create a conceptual model and blah blah blah, linked it to legislation. They have a really sound foundation for your target architecture. And as well, the data layer is the core for the entire architecture. Based on the data layer, you build your flexible services and so forth and so on. So it's well worth the investment of puzzling out how that works. Happy we took the time to do it.
fantastic. If you're in agreement, I think this would be a good time to
Yeah, absolutely.
end. But I'd like to thank you for your time. Fantastic presentation. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And please do keep an eye on the Open Group website. We have a number of other webinars coming up over the next couple of months, including a couple from Biz Design. So look out for those. So Baz, thank you very much. And I'll end today's presentation. Thank you.